recording. There we go. If I could ask everyone to just put their microphones on mute whilst Greg is presenting, so we don't get any dog barking or phones ringing in the background and whatnot, that would be great. Okay, Greg, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Speaking of dogs barking, I might have an issue with that. There's my little dog sitting over here on the couch, and he could get a little skittish if he hears neighbors or whatever. So just a warning. But thanks, Sarah, for inviting me to do this presentation and answer questions and everything. This also kind of combines two of my long-term interests. And in fact, I was doing my Egyptology degree at UCL, University College London, when I started, kind of embarked on this long journey of near-death experience, cross-cultural research. We were reading, ancient Egyptian funerary texts, Book of the Dead and pyramid texts and all that. And I just started noticing that they were kind of similar to, at least they recalled near-death experiences to me in various ways, just kind of in symbolic, general ways. And that reminded me of a book I read by Carol Zaleski, just kind of casually stumbled on it. My mom gave it to me, in fact, called Otherworld Journeys. And that's a book where she looks at medieval afterlife journeys in medieval Europe and in light of near-death experiences. So those two kind of things, I kind of put that together and started thinking, well, if there's that link in medieval Europe, which, by the way, I won't go into it, but I totally disagreed with Carol Zaleski in that book, because she went through all this effort to show these similarities and then said, but it's only in the imagination. And I thought, well, actually, it's if there's all these people having near-death experiences and they show up in their religious beliefs, then it seems to me that the experiences are informing the religious beliefs. And then later I stumbled upon scholars like James McLennan and David Hufford. David Hufford coined the phrase the experiential source hypothesis. And he was talking about sleep paralysis specifically. He kind of discovered sleep paralysis, finding that people have this phenomenon all around the world, but they interpret it in different ways. So I won't spend too much time on that, but it's just another type of extraordinary experience that people have that influences their spiritual beliefs or folk beliefs in the case of sleep paralysis. So anyway, combining NDEs and Egyptology led me to then do this comparative study of ancient Egypt and Vedic India. And then I added onto that to ancient China and Mesopotamia and Aztec and Mayan. But I'll talk a little bit about more of that in a minute. First, I just want to say, my slideshow is on the fritz. There we go. In case anybody doesn't know what near-death experiences are, a lot of people think that it's like, oh, I almost got hit by a bus, I had a near-death experience, but it's actually a lot more than that. It's when you almost get hit by a bus and your soul leaves your body and you have all these spiritual kinds of episodes. You feel like you traveled through a tunnel or some kind of darkness, emerging into light. You meet your deceased relatives, your mother or father. Sometimes it's not anybody that you actually knew in life or somebody that you expected. And then you also possibly will meet a being of light who will assist you in some kind of process of self-evaluation. Here's a list of the various types of commonly reported NDE features. People also will report that when they left the body, they saw their own corpse lying below, which is something that will come up later in the talk about Egypt. There's also obstacles and barriers, a feeling that the other world is returning to home, like the true state of being. It's somehow familiar, and they think like, this world, this earth is the dream state. This is the unreality, and that is the ultimate reality in the other world. But there's often a barrier, an obstacle that prevents them from actually getting there. And they also report things, feelings of oneness, transcendence, ultimate reality, or even divinization, feeling like they've become godlike or becoming one with God in some kind of way, whatever their God is. Which means I need to stress that NDEs are reported around the world. I have reports from pretty much every world region from throughout history, most cultures throughout history, but they're not all the same. So, for example, in small-scale societies, instead of leaving the body and floating up into another world, they leave the body and walk along a road to get there. In Western societies, the reason for being sent back to the body is often like you didn't fulfill this function, your full potential on Earth, or you need to go back and care for your child or your aging parent or whatever it is. Whereas in Eastern NDEs, it's often a case of mistaken identity, that they got the wrong Gregory Shushan, and they'll send the other one back and then take the correct one. Also, NDEs don't necessarily always happen. I mean, normally the ones that get the most attention are when somebody is clinically dead for a period, like flatlined brain waves. And there's a famous case, I'm sure a lot of people know, Pam Reynolds, where her body was drained of blood and she was put on ice and completely dead, but she was brought back to life, and all of her experience were demonstrably shown to have occurred during the time that she was clinically dead. So there's lots and lots of cases like that. I'm not putting my foot in the camp of believing that NDEs are actual evidence for an afterlife, but I'm also not putting my foot in the camp of saying that they're not, because that's kind of irrelevant to my work, which is basically the idea about the experiential source hypothesis, the degree to which NDEs contributed to afterlife beliefs in different religions, but also how they differed, how the different ways in which NDEs are incorporated into cultural beliefs. So my first study I mentioned was comparing Egypt with India, China, Mesopotamia, and Aztec and Mayan afterlife beliefs, all in periods when they had virtually no contact with each other. So there was no question of cross-cultural diffusion of a myth transmitting from one culture to another. I mean, remote possibility, considering the earliest times I was working with. None of these cultures really had, well, actually, I'll get back to that later. But first, what we'll say is that my methodology for this was really, rather than looking at NDEs, which were mostly absent, was to look at the afterlife beliefs in all these societies and see if they corresponded to what we know of as near-death experiences, and if they had all those same commonly reported NDE features. And they did. So all 6 of the civilizations had the same list of elements. And my conclusion for that was either somehow the human mind is constructing these beliefs in a very, very similar way and overlaying their own cultural ideas on top of it. And that accounts for this widely dispersed cross-cultural pattern of similarities. Or what I think is probably more logical answer is that people report NDEs around the world and they include these same types of features. So I think these afterlife beliefs are probably grounded to some degree in NDEs or knowledge of NDEs. So that was the kind of general summary of this 200-page book or whatever, but that was kind of the conclusions that I reached, that there is this experiential source hypothesis is embedded in the beliefs of all these cultures, but also there are psychological factors, cultural, political factors, like, for example, afterlife beliefs in a lot of cultures change over time as they become more accessible to the public, including in ancient Egypt. At first in the pyramid texts and coffin texts, it was mostly for the elite. And the more they became popular in the New Kingdom and later, they added more and more emphasis on judgment. So these lovingly detailed examinations of the types of punishments that you could endure if you have poor behavior, and then also really elaborate kinds of rewards that you might get for positive behavior. So, which to me, I think that's a very clearly a manipulation by the political elite. They're taking afterlife beliefs and using them as a tool to control the population, which is, even if they were based on NDEs at some point in the past, this accretions happen over time. So anyway, the second book I did was kind of taking the opposite approach, because we have a lot of near-death experience accounts from these indigenous religions. I looked at Native American accounts, African, and Pacific accounts, mostly from times when there was very little influence from Christianity or missionaries. So the difference here was, for Native Americans, for example, I found something like 70 NDEs or references to NDEs, like, very clear examples of them, and over 30 cases where the people themselves said, our beliefs were based on this person's experience who went to the other world and came back. It was the same in the Pacific. I found like 20 something, I can't remember. So that was basically, to me, complete proof, validation of the experiential source hypothesis. And unless we want to call the sources of the people who give us our material for study liars or deluded, or somehow they're unable to interpret their own experiences, which is unfortunately the approach a lot of scholars take. I don't. If we wanted to do that and just say they're liars, that's one thing. But otherwise, I think it's proof of the experiential source hypothesis for NDEs in a lot of civilizations, indigenous religions. But the other thing that was interesting to me about this study that engaged me in it was the differences between cultures. So in a lot of cultures in Africa and in Australia and in Micronesia, they didn't valorize NDEs really at all. Very few accounts reported. And those that were often, especially in African societies, often they were met with hostility. The people who came back to life were often treated as if, not like, oh my relative has come back, let's rejoice and have a party, I'm so happy to see you. It was more like, why is this anomalous, bizarre thing happening? This person must be possessed, there must be sorcery. And sometimes the person was persecuted for that. So I just thought that was a really interesting thing, and it's a good reminder to not universalize either about the experiences themselves or about how they're received around the world. So yeah, that's the kind of background to my general research framework. But today I want to focus on Egypt a little bit, because I know there's a lot of people interested in Egypt out there. You would think that a civilization like Egypt, who basically was, there was some BBC documentary years ago, and the announcer comes on and says, ancient Egyptians were obsessed with sex and death. This kind of thing. Everybody sees Egypt as like totally obsessed with the afterlife, and to an extent, that's true. Most of the surviving artifacts are related to the afterlife, and you would think that a culture that was had such a concern for the afterlife would have records of near-death experiences. But being ancient Egypt, it's not that simple. And a lot of you probably know that the uses to which writing was put in Egypt, as in a lot of early civilizations, was very limited. There weren't personal accounts. There was no like writing a book called I Saw Heaven and it getting on the New York Times bestseller list. There was like basically no context for this kind of reporting personal accounts. It was really accounting, record keeping, funerary texts. Later on in the Middle Kingdom, there was you get literature, narrative literary tales, like Tale of the Eloquent Peasant or the Shipwrecked Sailor, these kinds of things. But it was if you look through all the way through the Demotic period and the Demotic tales, there's really very few actual narrative kind of tales throughout Egyptian history. and ones that are, actually personal narratives are, practically non-existent. So technically speaking, there really are not any actual documentary NDEs from ancient Egypt. I'll just get that out of the way right now. But there are basically two classes of evidence, I think, for NDEs in ancient Egypt. The first are narratives that I think were probably intended to be instructional tales, tales that have some kind of moral message. And whether they were believed to be true or not, we don't really know. They could have been based on actual NDEs. So again, going back to that experiential source hypothesis, none of them actually read like genuine NDE accounts. They read really more like myths or legends of afterlife journeys, meaning that if they were grounded in NDEs, then they went through a lot of secondary elaboration after that, partly to make them more entertaining, more descriptive, and partly to enhance the kind of didactic, educational, moralizing aspects of them. So there's three of them, and I'll just go through them, hopefully not too quickly. The first one was preserved by Herodotus, who was a Greek historian. He recounted the underworld of the pharaoh called Rhampsinitus. And here's Rhampsinitus in a Dutch television show from the 1970s, and in a book by Louis Spence. There's no actual pictures of Rhampsinitus, but I'll get to that in a minute. The account itself is actually disappointingly brief, and all it says, and I'm practically quoting here, this king went down alive to what the Greeks call Hades, and there he played dice with Isis. And after winning some games and losing some games, he came back with a gift from her, a golden hand towel, or some people translate it as a handkerchief. Herodotus actually referred to Isis as Demeter, but he was translating for a Greek audience. He had this one-to-one correspondence between Greek gods and Egyptian gods. And so, but he was referring to Isis in that. So even with that very brief summary of this NDE, it has a few NDE elements. Rhampsinitus, he entered darkness, he met a divine being. Maybe as a moon goddess, Isis could have been radiating light, probably. Playing dice, that might have been related to some kind of challenge or test, a measure of one's worth in the afterlife, which is often a way to determine their fate. And Rhampsinitus returning, obviously the return is a key element of a near-death experience, otherwise they wouldn't return. The golden handkerchief, it's not like maybe the most spiritual ideal prize, but it also might have meanings that we're not quite understanding. There's some kind of significance that we're not aware of. But it is also anyway consistent with the idea that the other world is a place where there's, prizes, there's joy and abundance, and there's lessons and things, positive things to be taken back from the other world to this world, which is a cross-cultural thing and pretty much, I don't want to say all, but almost all afterlife myths, and it's also a very common thing in NDEs. It's basically the fruits of the experience, as William James would put it. On the other hand, Herodotus doesn't say that Rhampsinitus left his body, and he doesn't even say that he died. He just says he went to the other world. So the impression I get from this account is that there was a whole lot more to it than Herodotus has left us. And that's for a number of reasons. One of them is that Rhampsinitus is the Hellenized name for Ramses, and most Egyptologists and classicists think that Herodotus was referring to Ramses II in this account. Meaning that if we were to think that maybe this is an example of an experiential source hypothesis case, that we're dealing with the near-death experience of one of the most famous pharaohs in all of Egyptian history. A fragmentary summary of a mythologized account of his NDE, anyway, if you follow me. Ramses II was about 800 years before Herodotus. So, but I don't think that's an issue, because as we see in ancient Egypt, beliefs and ideas and traditions last for a very long time. And oral histories often have longevity because they're seen as being important. And we know that this account was important because Herodotus also mentioned that there was a festival that honored this king's journey to the underworld that was celebrated in every year. So even 8 centuries or so after the death of Ramses II, if Rhampsinitus is Ramses II, his journey to the underworld story was still being commemorated in a festival. This may or may not be the Sed festival, which is also possibly related to NDEs. The Sed festival was a festival of the king which happened every 3 years. And the purpose of this was to renew and revitalize the king's kingship. Part of the festival involved a reenactment of a journey to the underworld. The pharaoh enters his tomb and where his funerary belongings have been placed. And he, in the reliefs that depict this festival, he's shown with green skin to show that he's dead and also to associate him with Osiris. And he's then given the symbols of life, stability, and power by a god that he meets there. He's then instructed to wake up in actual hieroglyphic words on the text. And when the pharaoh is then revived, he revives not as Osiris anymore, but he's reborn as Horus, and he proceeds to the palace, and his kingship is renewed at that stage. So again, NDEs are this, one of the key themes behind them is this idea of renewal and revitalization and transformation. So the ritual that Herodotus describes is basically very similar to the Sed festival. He says that, Rhampsinitus, that the festival commemorates Rhampsinitus by having the priest or the king reenact his journey to the other world in a very similar way. Now it's interesting that, this festival and this account lasted for so long. They figure that, maybe as many as 14 times Ramses would have had his festival reenacting this journey to the other world, which, very much would have embedded itself into the consciousness of the Egyptian people, especially if they already have the afterlife on their minds quite a lot. And then here they have a narrative about it and a ritual and a festival devoted to it. And I think the idea that that was an important ritual is further supported by the second NDE type of narrative from Egypt, which is that of Setni Kamwas, that's his fictional name in the story. He's also known as Kamweset. He was the 4th son of no other than Ramses II. So we have this kind of lineage of underworld journey stories, a family lineage. I don't think NDEs run in the family, actually, so it's not hereditary. So I think it's, Setni's story is probably designed to reinforce his relationship to Ramses and Ramses's underworld journey as well. So the real Kamweset was a high priest of Ptah at Memphis, and he was known for his interest in Egyptian history. He's often called the first Egyptologist. He preserved monuments and reconstructed monuments and things like that. The story of his descent to the other world is very clearly a story. It's very clearly a fictional thing that combines Greek and Egyptian imagery, written around the Roman period. As far as we know, it might go back far earlier, but the only copy of it is around the reign of Claudius, 46 or 47 CE. Which is about 1,250 years after the historical Kamweset's death. So I think it's probable, given that expansive time, that it was probably based on an earlier text, or there is an early, or it's just a copy of an earlier text. It's poorly preserved and the grammar is bad, so it's kind of difficult to put it all together. But basically, the story is that Setni Kamwas's son, whose name is Si Osire, takes him down on a tour of the underworld. One day, Setni happens to be looking out his window and he sees 2 funerals going on. One is a funeral of a rich man, and there's all this great festival with people, mourners and richness and beautiful coffin and music and whatever. And nearby is the funeral of a poor man, and there's nothing. There's like a couple of depressed people just kind of dragging this coffin. There's no riches, no fanfare. And Setni says, this is so depressing, and surely that rich man is going to have a much better afterlife than the poor man. And so his son, Siosire, basically wants to teach his father a lesson, and says like, you think so? Let's go have a look. So he takes him down into the underworld. We don't find out how. And he takes him to see the 7 halls of the underworld in succession. Unfortunately, the first 3 are missing from the text. But when we arrive on the scene, we see the 4th hall, rather, is people being punished. And one of them is, there's people sitting there making ropes. And as they're making them, a donkey is at the other end chewing them, so they can't make any progress. So it's a Sisyphus type thing of any progress they make is being canceled as they do it. Also in that room, there are people who are standing underneath food and water that's suspended above their heads, and they're trying to climb up to reach it. And as they're doing so, people beneath them are digging holes to keep them from making any progress once again. And then in the 5th hall, there's a man whose eyeball has been impaled, and he's in there screaming and crying. In the 6th hall, we see the council of the gods, who are, it doesn't say this specifically in the text, but judging, by other Egyptological texts and images, this is the judgment hall of the soul, and judgments about the new souls in their life on earth are being evaluated in this scene. And then in the 7th hall, Setni encounters Osiris, who's there sitting on his throne, again described just as they are in images in the Book of the Dead and other texts. The tribunal of gods is there, and they have the balance to weigh the soul, to measure the faults against the good deeds, as it says. Anubis is there dictating to Thoth the good and bad deeds of the soul of the deceased. And it says that those who, it's explained to Setni rather, that those who have more faults than good deeds will be annihilated. Those who had more good deeds will be taken to the tribunal of gods, by the tribunal of gods, to heaven with the other noble spirits. Those who have about equal good and bad deeds will become servants to the gods. Setni then notices that there's a very rich, exalted looking, high ranking individual standing there with Osiris. And his son explains to him, that's the poor man that you saw, whose funeral was so miserable. He actually had a lot of good deeds on earth, so therefore he's reborn in this life, in this wonderful exalted position next to the gods. But that guy in the other room whose eyeball was impaled, he's the rich man you saw because he had more bad deeds than good deeds. The people making rope were the souls of people who work too hard, only to have their earnings robbed behind their backs by their women, which is not only a bit sexist, but it's also kind of adding insult to injury to the wounded party. And the people who are trying to climb up and get the food and water and being prevented from that, they're people who the gods prevented them from discovering their own lives, is how it's put in the text. A bit cryptic, but also a bit poignant maybe. And again, pretty unfair by our standards, because it's, these gods are putting limitations on your life and then punishing you for it in the next life, which, isn't that always the way it is? So at the end of the tour, Setni and his son go back up to Earth, and they come out at the necropolis at Memphis. And Setni asks his son, is this the place by which we went down, or is it a different one than the one we came up? Showing that he's confused. He doesn't really know what happened either. Unfortunately, his son doesn't reply, so we're none the wiser either. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. As St. Paul said, which is the extent of my biblical quotations. But it also says, interestingly, that Setni is left earth-shaken with wonder, by his experience in the other world, and that the experience weighed upon him heavily. And he decided that he was not able to share it with anyone, so he kept it secret. So, given this obviously very fictionalized account, could this have been based on a near-death experience? On the one hand, again, it involves some very NDE-like elements, like traveling through darkness, meeting deities, evaluation of his earthly life, or of one's earthly life, as we saw with these various characters being rewarded and persecuted. He saw other spirits of the dead that he had known on Earth, which is another common theme, and also the transformative effects that it had on him after he returned, this earth-shaking effect that it had on him. There are some NDEs that have, hellish types of imagery. So, we could stretch it by saying maybe those punishments were negative aspects of an actual NDE. But it's also, very much obviously a moralizing tale. And again, there's no temporary death. Once again, Setni doesn't actually die. And there's not even an illness context. He doesn't get sick and go to the other world. Also, the sort of systematized afterlife makes me a bit doubtful about the whole thing being an actual recorded NDE, because in most NDEs, you don't have this, council of judges and weighing of souls and things that are very obviously themes that go way back to the earliest Egyptian texts. So there's nothing innovative about this text. It's more like supporting or reinforcing existing Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. This kind of story is known throughout the world. Once again, there's examples from Mesopotamia and India and China. There's most famous one is Dante's Divine Comedy, but there's tons of other European ones, and it's possible that any or all of them were based in NDEs. But I think at minimum, they show awareness of NDEs at some point in the historical past, and they show awareness of some of the elements that make up an NDE. So it's also worth noting, by the way, just the idea of this family succession of NDEs, that there's Ramses II, then there's Kamweset, and then his son, who takes him to the afterlife, is the third member of this direct generation of families to go to the underworld. So there must have been some kind of importance around that, which is probably lost to us for all time. So our third and final case of a possible ancient Egyptian NDE or tale that was based on an NDE is that of Mereray and Sisobek, dating to around the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. So it's actually earlier than the last one we looked at. At least once again, the surviving example there, it might actually go back to the Ramesside period as well. This tale tells how a pharaoh named Sisobek became ill, and he was given only 7 days to live. And this magician named Mereray was summoned to the palace, and the pharaoh asked him how his life might be extended because he's afraid and he doesn't want to die. Mereray explains that the only possibility for this to happen is a substitute has to be arranged to go down to the underworld on his behalf, to die on his behalf, essentially. So the king basically cajoles and coaxes and bribes Mereray into doing it himself. And Mereray finally relents and says, okay, I'll do it. But he only does it because he's thinking, I'm a magician and I'll be able to come back. So before he leaves, he gets a statue of the goddess Hathor and takes it with him. And he thinks that that's going to be able, that's the thing that's going to magically enable him to come back to Earth. He arrives in the netherworld and he meets the real Hathor, and he tells her that he's there in order to ask for the king's life to be extended. And so she goes to Osiris and tells him why Mereray is there. And Osiris questions him about how things are going on Earth and about this pharaoh Sisobek's reign, and if he's doing a good job and things like that. And Mereray gives him a good report. So Sisobek says, okay, I'll give him an extension of life. he's got another 75 years, but you, my poor friend, can't return to Earth. You've got to stay in the netherworld forever. So it's not explained how or why, but apparently his magic Hathor figure doesn't work, but the real Hathor one day goes to Earth because she wants to go celebrate one of her festivals. And when she returns, she gives Meru some bad news that the pharaoh Sisebek has betrayed him. He's married Meru's wife, he's killed his son, and he's taken his house. So Meru is frustrated. He can't get back to Earth to seek his revenge. So he, being a magician, he gets a lump of clay and he makes a golem, which in Jewish folklore legend is a anthropomorphic figure made out of clay, which like does your bidding for you. So he gets this golem and he sends it back up to Earth, and it goes to Sisebek and tells him that I want you to kill all these other magicians, these fellow magicians, because they're the ones who influenced you to marry my wife and persecute me and kill my son and all this stuff. So he wants to get revenge this way. The pharaoh agrees to that, kills all the magicians, and the golem returns to the afterlife with a bouquet of flowers, which he gives to Meru, which is a kind of an unusual plot twist. Meru then takes those flowers and gives them to Osiris. The text is cut off at a certain point, so, and we don't know why he gives the flowers to Osiris. I think he's trying to bribe him to let him go back up to Earth. But all we know is Osiris actually gets really angry at him because he thinks that if you have flowers from Earth, you must have been to Earth, so you didn't do as I told you, and he gets angry. And that's the point where the text actually cuts off. But then there's a fragment later where Meru is back on Earth with Sisebek, so obviously he somehow returned. We just don't know how. In any case, this is very clearly a story, even more so than either of the other ones. Meru standing in for the king to go to the underworld for him, the golem, the role of Hathor. There was also no pharaoh in Egyptian history named Sisebek. There were a few historical Meru figures. We don't know if this is one of them or not. This is the one I put on the slide, is High Priest of Amarna. But again, it's just kind of for illustrative purposes. It could or could not have been him or anybody else. We're again missing details about the journey to the other world, which is really kind of the most important thing in relation to NDEs. But on the other hand, once again, he does go to the underworld by temporarily dying. He meets deities. He has an evaluation of life on Earth, or at least he does it by proxy for the pharaoh, because Osiris wanted to know about the pharaoh's life before he made his decision. And then he returns to Earth. So again, we have these kind of possible indications of knowledge of NDEs at the very least. So that's basically the three narrative examples of underworld journey texts from Egypt. But then we have the second class of evidence, which is what I really focused on in the first book. So, and I don't really have time to go into it a lot today, but I'll just kind of briefly review it. That these are descriptions of the other world that are found in the ancient funerary texts, which are essentially guidebooks to the other world to be used by the deceased. They begin with the coffin text in the Old Kingdom, and then the pyramid text in the Old Kingdom, and then the coffin text in the Middle Kingdom, and then the Book of the Dead, and many, many others in the New Kingdom and beyond. They're all very similar. Even the latest New Kingdom texts are basically riffing on the pyramid text, just getting more and more detail, but there's not a huge amount of fundamental change in them. But I think what's interesting about these guidebook texts is like the implicit message in them is if there's a guidebook to the afterlife and you accept it at face value as a guidebook to the afterlife, there are not many ways that text could have been written. There's not many ways somebody could have written these books without having the knowledge that they gained in order to write them. I can think of basically three. Either they were conveyed by divine revelation, some deity chooses some person and says, behold, this is what the afterlife is like. You shall write a book about it. Or mediumship. Maybe there were, some kind of mediums in touch with spirits in the other world, allegedly. Or, most likely because this is the kind of experience that people often report, they believed that they went to the other world and returned to tell us what they saw there. And again, all the common elements that we saw earlier are in these, all of these Egyptian texts. Soul leaves the body and travels to the other world, enters darkness, meets deceased relatives, a being of light in the form of the sun god, who's Re, judgment and weighing of the heart, obviously key themes in Egyptian texts and images, all sorts of obstacles and barriers and gateways, description of the other world being home and becoming one with various gods, and this kind of transcendent, omnipresent, omnipotent kind of descriptions, very mystical, cosmic kind of things if you read them. So one more thing before opening up for questions is just to look a little bit closer at one of these elements, because I just think it's really interesting, which is the out-of-body experience and seeing the body of yourself, of your own corpse below, and how these ideas might be symbolized in these Egyptian texts. I do have examples for basically all the other elements as well, like the sun god being the being of light, but yeah, I'll just focus on this one for now. Essentially, in the coffin texts, they describe how the corpse of Osiris is hidden in the depths of the underworld, in the darkness there. And this is described as one of the goals of the soul of the deceased. They're told, the newly dead person is told to go to reach this place of Osiris. And it says, those who see the corpse of Osiris will never die. The deceased will also make Osiris raise himself, which is a reference to the myth of Osiris's own resurrection. But the important thing here really is that in death, the person, individual soul who these texts are being addressed to actually become Osiris. So, and this association is made repeatedly, that the dead person is Osiris. So the encounter with Osiris's corpse in the other world is also an encounter with the corpse of the person who is the deceased soul who is traveling there. And seeing that corpse is not only makes the person never die, as is in that quote I mentioned, it's also said to be the revelation of a secret. This is very clear in the text. And that secret causes the true realization of death and immortality. And that realization of death and immortality is what enables the deceased to proceed to the next phase of the afterlife. So it's a kind of enlightenment that's brought about by the deceased seeing their own dead body and the realization that they're physically dead, yet spiritually still alive. And that theme, this encounter with the corpse, which is actually the self, leading to the realization that you've survived your own death, is, pretty much universal in NDEs, and it occurs over and over in Egyptian texts, Mesopotamia, China, Mesoamerica, and all over the place. So yeah, that's it. We can have questions now.
Thanks so much, Greg. That was really interesting. A beautiful presentation as well. I enjoyed your slides and your slide transition effects very much so.
Oh, thanks. I forgot this one. This was to illustrate the the soul leaving the body of the corpse.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about something specifically to do with NDEs. One of the things that I find most fascinating about NDEs is some of the accounts include essentially like divination of the future. And I think that that's a kind of good evidence for an NDE being a meaningful, in some way, experience that has a dimension of reality to it.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that realm being somewhere where divination occurs? Because the same is true of the dream state. The dream state is the place where you meet deities and you can have divinatory experiences.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I think some of the most compelling NDEs are ones where the Pekindarian experience, which is when somebody is in the other world having an NDE and they see somebody that they know who's actually alive on Earth, at least they think so, and then they come back to life and they're told, oh, actually, Uncle Ned died while you were dead. So that's a kind of divinatory experience, which I think is actually some of the strongest evidence for NDEs, out of any of those kinds of evidence, because there's really no possible way that person could have known that that person was dead, but yet they're seeing their soul during their own NDE. And there's also cases of children seeing relatives that they never knew and then identifying them from photographs or descriptions when they return. But there's also a lot of divinatory stuff that turns out to be wrong. I don't know if there's there's an article by Kenneth Ring quite a few years ago, early 90s or something. And quite a few people, and it was also replicated by Margot Gray, I think, in the UK. So two different studies independent of each other found all these supposed divinatory revelations in NDEs in UK and US, saying that, there's going to be a wide-scale destruction, either environmental or nuclear or whatever, and there's going to be rebirth into a new golden age of society, and it's going to be sometime around the late 80s, and all these very detailed things which are very similar. And of course, none of it happened. So that's another interesting thing, that things that are very compelling can come from these experiences, and then things that are just like mediumship. You can get these super interesting examples that make you think, well, there's no other way this could happen, and then you think, but then there's this kind of false information coming through.
Yeah. One of the things that I find really fascinating is just sort of contemplating what the actual idea of death was to ancient people. I read in an article recently about, I think it was a study of Neanderthals and their funerary practices. And one of the anthropologists said you should be wary of putting your ideas about biological death onto these people, because they may not necessarily have acknowledged biological death in the same way that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I just did an article for Eon, and we had a little back and forth about that, because I said, I was discussing a Native American NDE, and I said, he died and returned to life, and this was his description. And the reason I felt justified in saying that is because he said he died. His wife started his funerary preparations, and to all intents and purposes, within that culture, he was dead. But the editor was, kind of adamant that he wanted it to say, evidently he died, or apparently he died, or something like that, it's a fair point, but it's sticky, because I want to come down on the side of the culture and their definitions and their beliefs. But it's also with NDEs, because they can happen without a person actually being near death, or just believing that they're near death, then I don't know, whether they really were almost doesn't matter too much. Yeah. I'm sure you know that there's examples of people falling from great heights, like from the 19th century. There was a study, and they weren't ever in actually physical danger. They land at the bottom and they're not really hurt, but they had an NDE on the way down. And the same with people who think they're drowning. They never actually died.
A fear death experience.
Exactly, fear death experiences, yeah. And then sometimes, people report them that they were perfectly healthy, and they're not even anything to do with death, but they leave their body and go to a similar kind of.
Do you think that maybe the OBE was something that ancient people were able to achieve more easily, perhaps as our consciousness has evolved? We've become more kind of reconfirmed in this this particular kind of consciousness that we have now, because out-of-body experiences, I mean, it seems to me that the near-death experience is often a kind of response of the person to a very traumatic situation. Yeah. And so you kind of send an element of yourself out, almost in the way that people develop dissociation identity disorder. You kind of split off a part of your psyche because you can't cope with the level of trauma that your body's experiencing. Yeah. So I wonder what you think, or if you think there's any differentiation between OBEs, NDEs, false awakenings, and those other kinds of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a a really compelling idea that in times of extreme disassociation, your soul is just going to bolt the hell out of here because who wants to cope with the situation the way it is, and that would account for fear death experiences and all kinds of other stuff, and even possibly dreams of OBEs and things like that. As far as whether ancient people are more able to, do you mean like purposefully generate them? Like,
I just wonder whether it may have been more of their experience of reality, may have been that
right.
had
Yeah,
that potential to be out of body, because I think that our consciousness has evolved alongside cultural innovation, and the more writing and media and the more sort of entrainment that we have of our minds, the more we behave in certain ways. And so I wonder whether for ancient people, when they didn't necessarily have artificial light, they didn't have many distractions, that they were able to more vividly imagine and to have out-body experiences spontaneously without it seeming necessarily an extraordinary fact.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's definitely in the texts of the indigenous societies and the anthropological and missionary reports. I mean, I don't really want to equate indigenous people with ancient people, but it's non-Western and pre-industrialized, mostly small-scale people, so small-scale societies. So yeah, there's definitely, it seems like there's a good study by, I can't remember his first name, but Shields, and it's basically about out-of-body experiences in small-scale societies. It was in the Journal for Psychical Research in the 80s sometime. And he found, out-of-body experiences in something like 96% of all the small-scale societies that he reviewed, and just completely accepted as, a fact of life. And in some of the ones I looked at, not only was it a shamanic thing that, this deliberate form of leaving your body to go to the other world for whatever purpose, but it became part of a religious tradition for people that the shaman was teaching. And even in like quite large religions like the ghost dance or Indian Shaker Church, a lot of it was about, replicating NDEs or OBEs. And in a lot of the Chinese texts too, it's just lots of OBEs and taking these things for granted, and in the Indian stuff too.
Do you think it's possible that there was some kind of source culture for these myths and that influenced them as they dispersed over the globe? Because especially with Native Americans and the indigenous cultures of the Americas, they are thought to have crossed the Bering Strait, so that some ideas may have come from Siberia and Russia that also then went on to influence culture in Anatolia and Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible from the sort of shamanic practices filtering down from there, and some beliefs associated with them. But I'm super skeptical about diffusion kind of arguments, partly because, in just to stick with North America example, you have tribes that live side by side that have completely different languages, completely different myths, totally different culture, and then you'll have ones at different sides of the country with much more similarities. I would say if it happened, it was probably like, a certain Siberian tribe maybe kept some beliefs in a certain North American tribe, rather than any kind of like wide scale diffusion. And it's the same in the Pacific, like the areas that you would expect to influence certain areas have the least amount of influence on them. So yeah, I'm pretty skeptical about that diffusionism. There's like a whole chapter in my book about that, the first book. But I don't know, you could probably overstate it too. Maybe I overstate it. Maybe there was more than I think.
Pascal, have you got any thoughts, reflections, questions for Gregory?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thanks, many. But I think one which always comes back to me, and you kind of did touch on it just earlier, is, I mean, I kind of see a kind of progression, a potential progression, and tell me what you think about that potentially these, you know, very early near-death experiences seeded ideas about the afterlife and religious ideation, and but then that grew into shamanic practices in order for replication of these original early near-death experiences, which could have been very, very, very ancient. Right. And so the shamanic practices, which included entheogenic, you know, substance usage and all other manner of deprivations and austerities, and then that itself, you know, over millennia, then transformed into what we now recognize imminently as kind of contemporary religions and stuff. So that kind of progression, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that sums it up well. Yeah, I mean, I do think that you know, there's a lot of especially in the earlier anthropological literature looking at shamanism as the root of religion or whatever. Yeah. But I think at least in the otherworldly type of shamanism. So I mean, I should say, like, you know, shamanism can't be generalized about that. It's all different kinds of, you know, medical and magical healing practices and ritual practices. But the kind of shamanism we're talking about is, you know, the shaman leaves the body and goes to the other world. So yeah, I kind of think that because NDEs are a universal human experience and they're spontaneous, that they must have preceded shamanism and given shamans the idea of, like, you know, well, we can do this without dying. And so, yeah, that kind of shamanism, I think, is an attempt to replicate NDEs. And you know, some of them, again, in small scale societies, they also replicate the death and dying process. And even in that example of that said festival and the festival that Herodotus mentioned, that the king enters his own tomb, and it's this kind of ritual death and rebirth thing. In some of the small scale societies, it's similar. They would you know, lie down in a grave, or they would actually, you know, club themselves supposedly to death, or, you know, all these kinds of things to sort of bring about an artificial death, which they
clubbing yourself to death sounds really rough.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but that one I think is the most provocative, isn't it, of this idea? Yeah. So what society did you say that one was specifically?
I can't remember which one right now, actually, but I think it was in Melanesia, but yeah, I'm not sure. But yeah, that's one. And another one says that they burn themselves to death as well, but I'm guessing that was probably with, like, you know, virtual fire rather than,
right.
But I mean, who knows, because it's not only you know, these past societies, but filtered through whatever missionary or anthropologist or whatever. So we have these, you know, contained glimpses of what actually happened.
I've been talking to Luigi Prada, who's an Egyptologist, and he specializes in dreams in ancient Egypt.
Oh, right.
And I asked him if there were any accounts of dreams where people were flying, because that's such a common dream now. And apparently he's never found a single dream of an ancient Egyptian person dreaming they're flying. Wow. But presumably we have this association with the bird, and perhaps ancient Egyptians, because they didn't have an experience of human flight, conceived of flight as being requiring changing into a bird before you could fly. But I found that very interesting, because, you know, dreams are, generally speaking, culturally influenced in that way. So I thought that was a sort of interesting aspect of that.
Yeah, definitely. And also the soul in Egyptian afterlife, it ascends to the sky as well as descending to the underworld. So there's that sort of flight. I mean, that's why it has to be a bird, I guess, as you said. But that's another thing. I mean, that's another thing, like, to not overgeneralize about any afterlife beliefs. I said all these ideas are found, NDE ideas are found in the Egyptian texts, but the Egyptians also had this idea of the cyclical afterlife of, you know, traveling on the sunboat with Ray and then going through underworld, and that's not really reflective of NDEs. So at some point, you know, there's the it's really hard to disentangle what's cultural and what isn't.
I guess it's trying to make sense of this idea of death and I think a lot of it probably has to do with perceptions of time and the cyclical nature of time and seasons and life and rebirth, and trying to make sense of what happens in that downtime when the body dies, and what will happen when it begins regenerating. Julian asked an interesting question. He said the term for golem that you used in that text, what's the actual Egyptian word for golem? And what does it say here? Was any individual personal name given to the particular golem in the story? Do you know?
No, that one, I don't know what the Egyptian term was actually. No, I just, I looked at a translation. So, but that's an I think it might have just said like, you know, figure of clay or something.
Like the Descent of Inanna, she has those two, I think, are they kind of insects kind that she makes out of clay, and she sends them into the underworld.
Right, yeah. Similar kind of thing.
Let's just see what else. Does anyone else have any questions? Or Pascal, do you have any more questions? Arthur, did you want to ask something? We're having another talk when we restart again in September with JOANNE Backhouse. She's going to be talking about the kind of mythology and symbolism of mirrors. And in ancient Egypt, mirrors are associated with rebirth. And I was wondering what you might think about the mirror universe, or this idea of this other realm that we can see into when we look into a mirrored surface. And obviously in ancient Egypt, there weren't very many highly polished mirror surfaces, so people wouldn't have been as familiar with their reflection as we are these days.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know Raymond Moody has kind of started doing that a while ago, does that scrying kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting though in the Egyptian text that there is this fear of things in the other world being reversed. So exactly like it is here, but the other way around. And actually not just Egypt, and Aztec texts and other ones as well. Like if you eat, you know, whatever you eat here, you eat the opposite there. So you eat beetles and lizards or whatever. And there's a Egyptian text in one of the, I think it's in coffin text, it says, you know, not to be vulgar, but it says repeatedly, I eat with my mouth, I defecate with my anus, you know, so it's like all these affirmations of what I'm going to do, because the fear is that the opposite is going to happen in the other world, which would be pretty disgusting. So.
I think I read in your book, I think, was it an Aztec story where it said, yeah, whatever you eat in this life eats you in the next life.
Right, yeah.
Good case for veganism.
Yeah.
Exactly what I thought. Yeah, I took note of that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask. Do you think that these kind of ritualized death experiences that the kings and the pharaohs went through had something to do with the mystery tradition of the mysteries maybe of Osiris and Isis in Egypt?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, I know there's been this long running debate about mystery cults in Egypt, and most Egyptologists, you know, don't buy it and they think it's a Greek import or whatever. But and this, you know, was reported by Herodotus, so it is a Hellenized thing, but yeah, it could. I mean, it very much does sound like a mystery cult. And I think mystery cults as well are related to NDEs because, you know, they're also about entering darkness and rebirth and all this other stuff. So that's something I'm going to look at it in another book one day. Is Greek and Roman NDEs and mystery cults.
So they're kind of used to induce perhaps a fear death experience.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder. It's again, it's like with all this ancient stuff, we don't have enough to be able to say anything definitively, but I think it makes a lot of sense to say that you know, these kinds of rituals were exactly that, to put the initiate into this state of mind, and also probably, you know, with the mystery cults using some kind of hallucinogens as well. That and who knows, maybe in Egypt too, that yeah, put them in the state of mind. They're basically psyched out to have this afterlife experience, and they're surrounded by all the imagery and expectation, and the expectation of the transformation at the end as well. And what you were saying earlier about rebirth and everything too. There's also that parallel with the cycles of nature, especially with mystery cults, that death and rebirth of the person is associated with, you know, the waxing and waning of the moon, or the cycles of the sun, and the death and rebirth of agricultural plants every year, that kind of thing. So.
And what do you think about perceptions of time in some of these cultures? Because like you were saying, this idea of the sun passing through the underworld, and I know I've read in Mesopotamian literature there was this idea that as the sun passes through the underworld, it learns the secrets of the next day. So this is kind of how divination can work, because it's passing through that realm before we reach it on the other side of the planet almost. So I wonder what you think about the view of time and the idea of ancestors in particular, because a lot of these religions did kind of develop from ancestor cults. So the sense of time that these people possessed must have been vaster than ours, perhaps, you know, and in that way they could visualize this distant future where a dead person would come back to life again more easily perhaps than we can.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I haven't really thought that much about that, and that Mesopotamian example is really interesting, of the sun arriving sooner than we do. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ideas about associated with like a future golden age as well, that is kind of wrapped up with near-death experiences. So as far as, like, you know, you're saying about the vastness of time and the relationship of these experiences with time is, again, Native American, but also the Pacific and South America, they have these, people will die and come back to life, have an NDE, and they come back, and then a religion or cult is formed around them and around that experience. And almost universally, they preach that there's going to be sometime in the far future this new golden age that's going to be coming about. So as a form, again, as a form of divination, you know, they were told this or they saw this in the other world. And I think that's interesting because it's like a renewal and regeneration and rebirth of culture and society in the world, which is reflecting what just happened to the person who had the NDE. So,
what do you think the idea of cremation came from? Because in a lot of these cultures, it's very important to preserve the body. And then in India and China, you get a tradition of cremation.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like I wouldn't want to be cremated, because I would like to return to the earth and be eaten by worms. But how do you think the idea of being cremated came into religions?
I'm not sure, but there's some interesting texts in societies that do cremate. In India, there's one where the soul ascends on his own cremation smoke. So, which is interesting because it's, you know, that wouldn't be an Egyptian idea at all. So just the idea that the soul still leaving the body and ascending to another world can be achieved by these two vastly different ways. But yeah, as far as where it originally came from, I don't know, I'd be kind of tempted to have a functionalist explanation of that, that maybe they needed to be burned to be gotten out of the way in certain countries because they're potential for disease. But I don't know. I'm kind of a fan of incorporating, you know, traditional functionalist, structuralist kinds of explanations, because with the stuff like, you know, near-death experience and experiential source hypothesis, because I think that all of them have a place and we shouldn't, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just think that when anybody tries to use any one of these theories to explain everything, then none of them work. I think it's better to combine a number of them.
Do you think we're better off having a belief in an afterlife in terms of our moral duty, maybe as human beings?
Maybe. I mean, I think I think on one sense, I do kind of agree with the joke that, you know, it couldn't hurt, because if you find out that there's not an afterlife when you die, your life of believing in it is not going to matter, really. I mean, it's not going to be like, you know, you're humiliated and disappointed that you're wrong. So in a sense, it's, you know, why not believe in one? But yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends on the individual. Maybe some people need to believe in that to have a moral compass, or to feel like they can only be good if they're going to get a reward, or that they're going to refrain from being bad so they won't be punished.
I joined a lot of Facebook NDE groups and things like that when I knew you were coming to do this talk, and it's interesting seeing what people say about their various accounts and how they, you know, often obviously people are religious and then they have experiences where they see God, and they tend to be culturally specific to that person to some extent. But are there any examples where people have seen things that they absolutely didn't expect?
I think the best example of that is atheists who, you know, have no belief in an afterlife or God or anything, and they have a full-blown NDE. And the most famous example is a British philosopher, A.J. Ayer, who had his NDE, and he came back, and he's like, you know, materialist philosopher, known for his materialism, and he comes back and says, no, I had an NDE, I'm going to have to change all of my opinions and theories. And later he kind of recanted, but just, yeah, I think that's the best example. I don't know of any examples of, like, you know, a Christian seeing Rama and becoming converted or anything like that. I think and that would kind of, I think, go against the idea that NDEs are this kind of ground of universal experiences upon which culture is overlaid. So I think if there is such a thing, objective being of light, then it's like in, you know, the Tibetan belief that it's going to be seen as whatever you're conditioned to see it as. So,
well, I imagine that religious ideas create a kind of feedback system in that way. You know, the more it's written about the gods, you're almost creating avatars that can then people your dreams. And I often think about the mystery rituals and how the deepest integration of the things that you had witnessed during the final performance of the Telesterion would actually be processed and integrated when you dreamt about them, because they're so archetypal and primal that they would really inspire interesting dreams, because they're taking people out of their normal routine, and they're constantly kind of testing and pushing them, and they're fasting and they're dancing, and they're becoming ecstatic. So those are all the sorts of things that help you have interesting, weird experiences, especially weird dreams and out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, and also grief itself. I mean, there's examples of, you know, myths about people mourning in intense grief at the grave of their loved one, and then they leave their body, or they have some.
I mean, that's a big performative element of the funerary rites, isn't it? Having even a paid group of mourners who are like wailing and kind of paralyzed with grief.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to think of grief as being that also has that potential to separate you from your body and disassociate.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely. If you had to go back to any sort of religious afterlife system, which one would you opt for?
I don't know. I think they all have their issues. I mean, I think the Tibetan one is amazing because
quite judgy.
Yeah, I think the Tibetan one is amazing because they were obviously totally clued in about near-death experiences. You know, they incorporate them in their beliefs. But I'm not sure about you know, the reincarnation. I know there's really interesting evidence for it, but I'm not sure. And I kind of tend to think like if reincarnation and NDEs and mediumship and all this kind of stuff is genuine, then it's either working on like a random basis of nature, like any other random process that happens in nature, or where people are getting what they expect. I'm not really, I'm kind of puzzled about that because, you know, most of the cases of reincarnation, like that Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker studied, come from India, but there are ones that are totally unexpected from the West. And so I don't know if that's a reporting issue and that there just hasn't been a way for people to report them here as much as in India. But that's one of the things that confuses me about the whole thing, is like, who's going to be reincarnated? Who's going to just have an NDE-like experience and go to this other world, and why? And so, and I don't think any religion really addresses it in a way that's totally satisfactory to me. And part of that is moral objections, because, you know, reincarnating, choosing your reincarnation, you know, which some people say is kind of horrible. It's like you've chosen to be in whatever, you know, horrible situation.
Karma. You don't like the idea of karma?
You know, if you can't remember what you're paying for in this life, and you only remember it between lives, and you're gradually building up merit to reach nirvana. I don't know, maybe. But I don't like the idea that that the amount and extent of suffering that people have to endure on Earth, that's paying for something they did in the past that they don't even remember. I just I don't buy it.
I like
At least I don't like it.
I like the idea of dying well. You know, at the moment of death, having or as much as one can, a beautiful experience.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's a new kind of trend for death doulas, and for actually thinking and celebrating about that moment as being a transition into something, you know, the next human experience or the next experience of consciousness. And I think that that's something that would probably improve society if we weren't so terrified of dying. And do you think that ancient people were less terrified of dying than maybe we are now? I mean, not as a whole, but in general, were there, I mean, the Aztecs seem to be like quite keen on dying.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think there might have been more, I think there is more fatalism in some cultures than there is in, you know, in Western culture. I think there's acceptance. You could call it fatalism, or you could call it acceptance, depending on what spin you want to put on it. But yeah, I don't know if I would say it was a difference in ancient or modern, or if it was just a difference in cultures around the world, or even individuals. I mean, I know a lot of people who are really afraid of dying, and a lot of people who, like me, I'm afraid of the pain and the suffering, but I'm not afraid of the death part. So, because I think, I guess that's going back to the idea of afterlife, of whether it's beneficial to believe in an afterlife. I think we're probably going to have an experience very much like an NDE when we die, and that's either going to be a transition into this amazing new state of being, or reincarnation, or whatever, or it's going to be the last thing we experience before we're annihilated. And if that's the case, it's going to be you know, a pretty great, profound experience anyway, because it's, you know, supposed to be this incredibly joyful, magical, transcendent thing.
Does the kind of state of the body reflect the quality of the NDE, or does there seem to be, you know, for example, if people have NDEs when their body's experiencing intense trauma, as opposed to a kind of gentle dying situation, is the content of that NDE reflective of the state of the body?
Well, I know that, like, with very violent, sudden NDEs, they're more likely to have a life review, for example. But whether somebody's dying of a heart attack or of cancer or something, I'm not sure. I don't know if that's been really looked at, but it's an interesting.
Just to jump in, there is some interesting examples. I think when you look into enough of the NDE accounts, and in Bruce Grayson's recent book, there's a couple of interesting examples of the state of the body during the dying kind of process, it looks like very much influencing the content of the near-death experience.
Oh, okay.
For instance, there was someone who was in a car crash and had a ruptured liver, and in her kind of content, the imagery of her near-death experience, she was kind of in this hellish state where she was being kind of intestinally sort of gouged kind of thing, or, you know, there being this deliberate punishment, like burning in her kind of abdomen area, and another kind of examples of that.
God.
Pascal, how does that reflect in the NDE or the sort of out-body experiences of things like DMT, or the kind of experiences of seeing other entities as well?
What do you mean? What parallels?
With the near-death experiences in ancient Egypt, or ideas of the afterlife in NDE experiences, do you get judgments at all?
In DMT? Yeah, I mean, it's not judgments, I don't think, per se. No, I mean, it's interesting with the modern kind of DMT experiences, when DMT is becoming more used now, and it's similar to Zaleski that Gregory mentioned earlier about this, who wrote about the progression from kind of much more Christianized, you know, judgmental fire and brimstone experiences toward more modern experiences, which were much less judgmental and more kind of rehabilitatory, where the entities were more like guides as opposed to like angels or torturers. And I think you see that very much in the DMT experiences. But again, you know, as these beings being very much these sort of mystical guides, and showing you maybe your lives, having evaluation of your life, but in a, you know, when it's a beneficent guide, a very kind of unconditionally loving kind of way often. But again, if that may be a function of the fact of them being recent DMT experiences.
That's interesting.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Gregory before we go? Thanks so much, Greg. It's really interesting. Thanks for
Thank you.
answering all of my questions as well.
No problem. Yeah, anytime.
Oh, here we go. Susan, I agree with Gregory that attitudes are maybe more attached to a culture than ancient versus modern. Sufism is a prime example of death being celebrated in current cultures. I was fortunate to visit the tomb of Mevlana Rumi last year on his death anniversary, and the feeling among the Sufi that had come from many places to be there was not sad at all.
That's great.
And yeah, Karen asks, I will be sending the link out. I'll send the recording of this to everyone that's got a ticket, so you can see that. You can watch that later on. It should be up by this evening. So yeah.
Could I, if we're wrapping up,
yeah,
is it possible to ask one burning question?
Of course.
It's similar to maybe one that you get often, Gregory, about the kind of ontology, but I mean, I would like to hear your thoughts on the likelihood, the kind of difference in likelihood between the similarities of the accounts of the afterlife in different civilizations and near-death experiences, being due to the actuality of the experience, the kind of ontological independent reality of them, or the fact of us all having shared human nervous systems.
So you mean if that similarity points more in the direction of NDEs being vertical experiences of the afterlife or a dying brain kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, like, because you could, what is the best evidence that you would say there is to put your money on either one?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the whole experiential source hypothesis thing can kind of be used to bolster either theory. So you could either say, yeah, our brains all are compromised in the same way, and so therefore we have similar experiences, or you could say it's the same, you know, transcendental reality. I mean, I think that the idea that NDEs happen or can happen, as we said, with fear-death experiences or spontaneously or and through similar things through drug use or whatever, those kind of suggest that it's, you know, it's obviously not a dying brain. So it's the brain doing something else other than just dying. So maybe that could point to, you know, that it's actually is doing what it seems to be doing, going into some other, the mind be going into some other transcendental kind of state. But I think it's, you know, it is a difficult thing to get at through the cross-cultural research that I've done. And I've kind of, you know, tended to sidestep the issue because of that very reason that that I haven't had to go into it. But yeah, I will say that you know, none of the materialist theories have convinced me that, you know, they don't explain away NDEs and all of their, you know, similarities and differences. So you know, if it's just a dying brain, there shouldn't be as much variation as there actually is. And as I said, they shouldn't be happening when the brain isn't dying. So yeah, and the Picandarian experiences and the other kinds of evidence, they're pretty compelling. So.
Yeah.
Julian asked, is there much difference between the NDEs in different cultures, or do they have like the same kind of features all over the world?
Yes, and yes. I would say those kinds of elements I was talking about in that earlier slide. Let's see if I can go back to it. Oops, sorry. This one, I mean, these kind of basic thematic features, they're pretty much, you know, in NDEs all around the world. Not that every NDE has each one of them, but they all have a number of these. But no, so you might have like going through darkness, coming out into light, and meeting some kind of being that's radiating light, and that being helps you with your judgment of self-evaluation of your life, and then sends you back to your body for whatever reason. But the way those things are manifested is very different from each culture. So again, with the idea of, you know, a Buddhist isn't going to see Jesus, and at least isn't likely to. So there's these
environment reflected much in the NDE experiences, because reading your book, the Aztec and the Mayan afterlife and underworld accounts are kind of the most brutal and bloody and sort of seething. And do you think that's a reflection of the kind of inhospitable environment that they were often living in?
Yeah, but then the Aztecs also had these flowers and songs poems, and they had this very kind of beautiful idealized afterlife ideas. And yeah, and the Mayans also had very positive ones as well. So, but yeah, I think they do. And I think that's why you get, you know, NDEs where people see, you know, a library with Greek columns and people in robes and things like this, or they see some, you know, beautiful idealized field of flowers or plains or that kind of thing. So, so yeah, but I mean, there's not. I would say most NDEs don't even get that far anyway. They're sent back by the being of light after having these other experiences. Actually, seeing an unearthly landscape is probably less common than the other stuff. Maybe happens at a later stage. And also life reviews are really uncommon outside of Western cultures. And
well, that's interesting. So do you think that could be a kind of reflection of the development of the ego in Western culture?
Yeah. In fact, I guess it was Alan Kelly here is the first to kind of note this. He's one of the first people who looked at NDEs in small scale societies, and that's exactly what he said, that basically it's they didn't have as much differentiation between self and community. So it's not like it's all about me. This is like this dying is about everyone. So I mean, they didn't have life review about the entire society either, but maybe it just, you know, that made it irrelevant. But yeah, it's interesting. And then in Australian cultures, there are very few NDEs, but their shamanic traditions involve, you know, life reviews and all kinds of NDE features. So it's almost like they didn't need to have NDEs because they're already doing them. But then when they do report them, they're similar to shamanic experiences. And I almost wonder if when they report an NDE, they're actually just classifying it as a shamanic experience, whether the person was near death or not.
Karen asked you, Pascal, I think, do you know anything more about the woman with the liver injury? And do you think that because her NDE reflects the things that were happening in her body, that it was her mind making sense of the physical issue, not actually an NDE?
Well, this is sort of just part and parcel of what I'm doing in terms of the paralleling of psychedelic and near-death experiences, because it's very informative, I think, to not reduce the near-death experience per se as a endogenous type psychedelic experience, but see that it can be very instructive to think of it in that way, like this in terms of set and setting, one's mindset and expectations, and then the physical and interpersonal environment that one's in when they have a psychedelic experience very much informs the content of and valence of the experience. And that's, I think, very similar with near-death experiences to varying degrees, perhaps less of a degree because it might be much more of a dissociative experience in NDEs, and therefore you're less interacting with the environment in order to influence it. But I think that is a good example of the sort of set and setting, the context, physical sensations, which can incorporate into the narrative of the near-death experience. Yeah.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you so much, Gregory. I'll let you go now. I think we've
actually, I also wanted to just say one more thing. Sorry, I was just thinking about the question about whether NDEs are the same all over the world. People often have like a real vested interest in that idea, and people, especially people who've had NDEs or people who are very spiritually inclined towards wanting to believe in them, and they want them to be the same all over the world. And this is like, seems to be something that would validate the experience for them or help them to believe in them a little bit more strongly or something. But I don't think it's a problem to believe in an afterlife and believe that NDEs are evidence of an afterlife, and also accept that they're different in different cultures. Because if you think about it, there are not very many experiences that we have in life that are the same for everybody. And even less so when you start looking at these vastly different cultures. So I don't think there's any reason to even expect that the afterlife would be the same for everybody. And so I don't think that's a deal breaker. And I also think that being an atheist is totally consistent with belief in an afterlife, or it can be anyway. I think you can be an atheist and still believe in an afterlife because of things like NDEs. So
I think we're going to make our own afterlife.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, that's the whole. I don't want to open another can of worms, but if there is an afterlife, if this stuff is real, to me, what makes the most sense is going back to the philosopher H.H. Price and his idea of an interdependent, intersubjective afterlife, he called it, where everybody is kind of having a lucid dream together and they're co-creating it.
Oh, that sounds epic.
Yeah, because if it's just your own, if it's just your own lucid dream, then it's kind of pointless. You're just there alone. It's like locked in syndrome, lucid dream for eternity. But if it's happening with everyone else, then it's this kind of idealized version of what we should have on Earth, but don't.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that point up. That's a good bit to end it on, I think. Thank you so much, Gregory, and thank you so much to everyone for coming along, and I'll send the link out for this. And then, as I was saying, I'm going to have a little holiday break now and come back in September when we have, I think I've got 3 really great talks booked in. I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, but Jay Silverstein is going to be talking about Bronze Age collapse. And then we've got JOANNE Backhouse talking about mirrors and the myth and symbology of mirrors in ancient Egypt. And then we have Luigi Prada talking about dreams in ancient Egypt as well. So some really good ones when we come back in September. So thank you very much, Greg, and thank you very much, Pascal, and thank you very much to everyone for coming along. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and start working on creating the best possible afterlife for yourself.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to everyone as well for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers,
Take
Greg.
care.
So much.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.